So there's a beautiful concept in painting called trompe-l'oeil, and it refers to paintings that have this character of making it seem as if they're truly a three-dimensional space. They're kind of illusion, and you look at these paintings, and it might really seem like there's this garden or something like that, for example, or whatever, some kind of space, and the more cleverly the painting can deceive you into believing that there really is this sort of three-dimensional space within it, the more successful the trompe-l'oeil effect is. So one way of thinking about ego and the illusion of Maya is as a series of trompe-l'oeil pictures that are being presented to you. And these pictures are that I am a person doing something in the world, basically, existing in relationship to elements in the world, right? The sort of I and the element of experience and of control and of decision-making and memory and desire and fear and all of that together, that constellation takes place in a thought that has an illusionary quality to it, like a trompe-l'oeil quality, and that arising makes it seem as if you're a body and a mind engaged in the world. The purpose of self-inquiry and surrender is to recognize this illusionary thought as an illusionary thought. And by doing so, to therefore be able to cut the illusionary aspect of it. Because trompe-l'oeil depends on, in a sense, temporarily losing that sense of it as something separate and being sort of absorbed into the illusion. So there's a series of like these I other pairings, this I experience pairings that are these objects of which you're aware. So it seems. And through inquiry and surrender, we sort of recognize these objects. Now, and the funny thing is, these very recognitions of the objects are themselves another trompe-l'oeil. That is, the first trompe-l'oeil is sort of enclosed in another illusion, which is the illusion, let's say, that we're dealing with the first trompe-l'oeil, that we were taken in by the first trompe-l'oeil, that there was an I who experienced this thing, that took it in, that distracted it, that made it think it was real, and that the same I then dissociated itself from that thought. That's an illusion also. And it kind of nests the first illusion within it. And so too, thoughts about the practice, the idea of being distracted from the practice of surrender or self-inquiry, of being lost in thought, of coming back from that being lost, of forgetting and remembering. That entire narrative, you could argue, is another trompe l'oeil, right? It's hard to even think about the geometry of how these are nested. But they are nested. And the idea is any particular I other combination is a kind of illusion. The idea that it's an illusion and that you've recognized it as an illusion is also an illusion. The idea that you've failed to recognize it is an illusion. The entire narrative about how one is recognizing these illusions is an illusion. And these are nested pictures, right? It's like a picture of a picture of a picture. Each of these pictures has that illusionary trompe l'oeil quality to it. And they have a kind of endless depth. So all these meta thoughts about the practice are kind of stepping back from one layer of the illusion only to find oneself in another layer of the illusion. And we are stepping quote unquote backward, but backward is also in an illusion. It's in a thought. It's in a kind of I other experience. So one steps backward through a sequence of these, through inquiry and surrender. But the illusions keep going and going, because the very idea of illusion is illusion. The idea that there is trompe l'oeil at all is nothing but another trompe l'oeil. There's something outside the trompe l'oeils entirely, which is unthinkable and which is not of their nature. By tracing the illusion through quote unquote layers of the illusion, the hope is not to be able to get to some beginning illusion, because the trompe l'oeils go on endlessly. The nesting is infinite. But rather to recognize in the process of moving through these seeming layers that the layers themselves are within something which isn't in the layers. That there's something continuous even as there's something changing. What is the continuity within that change? It isn't something you can think. It isn't something you can feel. It isn't something you can perceive. But it can be understood, so to say, negatively by the process of this continuous discernment of illusion. The illusion of engaging in a practice, the illusion of failing or succeeding at that practice, the illusion of time and of the narrative and of the story, and of this sort of inescapable set of thoughts that are kind of this endless labyrinth, this sphere without beginning and bottom and top, and and whose dimensions can't be imagined. In the so-called continuous recognition of this thought illusion, right? And of the recognition that there's only the thought of illusion, right? There's the thought of someone being deceived. And actually, not even that. Even that is also a thought of the thought of the thought of someone being deceived, and so on and so on and so on. And so actually, there's no one to even say this entire sequence exists. Because the I who would say that is itself caught up in the sequence. Any I who could speak, who could conceptualize, who could feel, who could perceive, is in that sequence. So we move out of these sequences by letting go or through inquiry, so that it might become clear that the sequence of illusion is itself grounded in something else. By moving along that axis of illusion, it becomes clearer and clearer that something there is that is not that, but in which that inheres, which cannot be directly referred to. Precisely because if it could be referred to, then it would be a thought, then it would be in the illusion, then it would be subject to those layers. So surrender and self-inquiry are in some sense as a voluntary process going to be doomed to a certain kind of failure. Because as many thoughts as one recognizes and moves away from, nevertheless that too is a thought, that too is a thought, that too is a thought, and there's no escape from this prison. Because the prison has endless, infinite layers. But the entire infinitely layered prison is itself but a thought. And so in the infinitely smooth, fast falling away from such thoughts, which results from what? From the recognition, the idea that there are such thoughts is itself but a thought. From the revisitation of that fact through surrender and inquiry, right? It's not really an intellectual understanding, obviously. It's something that reprompts inquiry and surrender. It reprompts that coming back through the layers. That coming back through the layers is a revisitation of the fact that the layers don't exist. If the layers don't exist, the coming back through them also doesn't exist. The recognition that they are such layers is also non-existent. But there's only one having thoughts, of somebody, having this whole experience. And even that can't be said to be the case. Because there's no beginning to this. in the process of drawing through the layers, there is, despite the layering movement, which is change, which is alteration, an unspoken, unimaginable continuity, which is outside those layers, so to say. It is so outside them that it is not incompatible with them. It is so not them that it can also be them, because they don't exist to sully it. So this is the strange nature of illusion. Illusion isn't a specific thing that you can exit. Illusion is many-layered, infinitely layered, and moving through those layers, the point of it, through inquiry and surrender, is to recognize the nature of all the layers themselves to be but an image. And immediately on the other side of that coin is the silence. It's the silence that accepts that it cannot understand what that silence is. The absolute silence, I mean, the true silence, the silence of the self. As soon as it tries to understand, as soon as it tries to see, then it's caught back up in the illusion. As soon as the mind says, but how? But how? How does it work? How does it work? I don't understand. I don't understand. I don't understand. How does it work? But, right? That's the illusion. So, we can, through surrender and inquiry, engage with that, right? And effortfully ignore the thought or inquire into the I, each time severing thought, or the effectiveness of thought, anyway, the potency of it, the sharpness, the poison of it. But the end result can only be an understanding that the game isn't what it appears to be. You can't win the game that way, directly. One can only recognize that the game can only be won, so to say, by not playing it. And that one, in fact, isn't playing it. Already, one can never play it. The game cannot be played. One is already out of the game. Something has to be unlearned, maybe, through this process. Discerned, perhaps. Not the self. The self cannot be discerned. But the trick of the illusion, which moves infinitely backwards, if that can be glimpsed even from the corner of one's eye, then one might have the faith to turn away from the mind and find that other mode of knowing, which is non-mental. That knowing which is by being, which is without intermediary, which is without reflection, which is without thought, and which is so without thought that it occurs even within it. If there is thought, which only thought says there is. That is the trompe l'oeil of it all.